Hi, I'm Lauren Pacell of Tink Media, a podcast growth company. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to launch a podcast from scratch. The podcast space is so saturated that getting a podcast off the ground can be tough. If a podcast is launched without a marketing plan, will anyone hear it? Not necessarily. But there are things that can be built into any podcast marketing plan, no matter the genre or size. We'll be going over 3 things that you can do to ensure that your launch day goes off with a bang. Submitting your show to be featured on podcast apps, pitching your podcast to newsletters, and securing a feed drop and some promo swaps for upcoming episodes. When you launch a podcast, it doesn't automatically get featured everywhere, onto podcast listening apps, into people's newsletters, or mentioned on other people's shows. You have to put it in front of the right people, and that takes a little bit of work. If you don't do it, you're just hoping that people stumble upon it. And with so many podcasts, that rarely happens. You can tell your friends and family, but what if they aren't podcast listeners? I know, I can't even imagine it either. It's really hard to turn a non-podcast listener into a podcast listener, but that's not your job. It's easier to find people who are already listening to podcasts. First, submitting your podcast to listening apps. Podcast listening apps like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify have Airtable forms that anyone can use to submit their show for app placement consideration. This means that when people open their apps, your show is up front or in a carousel. Remember that the apps like to consider their home pages like a newsfeed. They want things that are relevant and timely. So when you're making your pitch on the form, make sure they understand why you and why now. If it's a new show, there's your reason. That's exciting and something they might want to spotlight. It's important to think of this as a co-marketing opportunity. These apps are businesses and they want to know how you will help them if they feature you. So note in the form that you will tweet about it or mention it on your show if you're chosen to be featured by saying, "Listen on Apple Podcasts," or "Thanks to Spotify for promoting the show." On most of these forms, you have the option to choose a region to be featured. Most U.S. podcasters choose the U.S. space. Just because you're a U.S. podcaster doesn't mean you don't have listeners all over the world, and the U.S. space is really crowded. So if you think you might have listeners in another country, choose that country. You have a higher chance of being featured there. Finally, make sure you fill out the form at least 2 weeks before launch. You shouldn't submit more than once every few months, and you can submit when only your trailer is live. I also think that submitting to newsletters should be part of every single podcast marketing launch plan. Podcast newsletters are really powerful. Their readers are actively searching for new podcasts to subscribe to. So make a list of podcast newsletters that might feature you. If you go to substack.podcastmarketingmagic.com, there's an issue on podcast newsletters that you can pitch yourself to. Subscribe to them all. Become a part of the newsletter community before you pitch. Spend a few weeks reading them. Read a few issues to make sure that you're a good fit. Understand what they're looking for and what kind of things they like to write about. And when you do pitch, don't do a cold pitch. Respond to a newsletter issue that they've sent out. If you respond to something they've written, they'll know that you receive their newsletter and enjoy it and really think that you're making a pitch that makes sense. I get pitched a lot of podcasts for my newsletter, Podcast the Newsletter, and I don't have time to read all of the cold pitches. But when I send out an issue of my newsletter and someone responds to it, I always read it. When you're pitching yourself, make a letter that's short. 100 words is great, no longer than 300 words. And make it really personal. Indicate why the newsletter audience needs to know about your show. Finally, I think a good launch plan includes a feed drop secured the day of your launch onto the feed of another show and some promo swaps secured for your upcoming episodes. You know what a promo swap is. That's when you hear a podcaster say, if you like this show, you'll like this other show. So step 1 is finding podcasts with similar audiences and reach out to them. Send them a nice note. Ask them if they will run a 30-second ad for your show, and you would do the same for them. If you're new and have fewer listeners, to make it fair, you might consider doing more than one promo ad in exchange for their one, or dropping an entire episode of their show onto your feed in exchange for some promos from them. This is where you have to put your bartering hat on. Think, what do I have that they want? And what do I want that they have? Maybe you have a newsletter or social media with a following that you could use to promote their show in exchange for them doing a promo swap on theirs. Another tool you can use for collaboration is a feed drop. A feed drop is when you drop an entire episode of your show into the feed of another show and vice versa. If you're starting from scratch, find those people with similar audience overlap and ask them if they will drop your first episode into their feed on your launch day. Then in return, offer to drop an episode of their show into your feed once your season is done. Make sure to drop it at the end of the season when you have more listeners. You can find good audience matches by searching shows that you feel are a good fit and scrolling to the bottom where it says listeners also subscribe to. That's Apple data telling you where you have audience overlap. There's also a great way to find audience overlap if you go to raphonic.com/graph. If your show hasn't launched yet, you can search other shows that are similar to yours. Friends of those shows are friends of your shows. There's also a podcast promo swap database at tinkmedia.co. You can enter your show for consideration from other podcasts that are looking to swap. And you can also browse podcasts based on size and genre so you can find a new podcast to work with. Podcasting is such a collaborative space, and that's what makes it so great. So I hope you'll have fun reaching out to new podcast friends and figuring out ways to work with them. I think it'll help both of your shows grow, and you'll have a really great time doing it.